Hi everyone, and welcome to this session of the PhenoLab. Today it's my pleasure, honor, and joy to host the book launch of the ROUTLEDGE Handbook of Phenomenology and Mindfulness, which is a monumental work in the interdisciplinary field of philosophy and contemplative studies, but of course not limited also to these fields. I'm extremely happy that the editors of the book, as well as some of the many contributors invited to participate to this book project, are
Board.
here with us. Um, Susi Ferrarello and Christos Hadjioannou. I deeply apologize for pronouncing your surname, Christos. I'm terribly bad at this. So I would like very much to give the floor to Susi and Christos, and just to say some introductory word, and then move directly to the speakers.
Okay, so first Susi.
Yeah, I will leave the floor mostly to you because I know you prepared something more. I just would like to ask. All right. So I know that Christos prepared something more articulated. I would just take these few minutes to thank all of you for the amazing job you did and to recollect a little bit the story from which this book was born. It was totally unexpected, I would say, for me and Christos to become the parents of this magnificent book. It started as a reflection, remember, Christos, on stoicism. After all, I mean, we started working on a project on phenomenology and stoicism, and that led us to reflect on the importance of the role of the present and the present in relation to feelings, emotions. And from there, we created a call for paper that gave scholars freedom to go beyond stoicism, because we realized that that theme was important not just for stoicism but for other traditions. Then we were amazed about the variety of abstracts, and we wondered what do we do with these abstracts now, because they go in so many directions. And so we were truly blessed with productivity, because we created a journal issue. Marc here, for example, contributed both to the journal issue and the handbook. And in the handbook, the handbook was born as, at the beginning, an attempt to put together this reflection on being present. But then we realized that there was a structure behind, and we wanted to be loyal to different traditions, the Western, Eastern tradition, to the questionability of mindfulness. And then there's a section on are we truly doing mindfulness, to the tradition that phenomenology can create in relation to mindfulness. So it was really a fantastic journey of learning and discovering in progress with all of you. And I'm truly thankful to have worked with so many excellent minds. And I feel incredibly lucky to have found wonderful colleagues like Christos and Francesca in, life happens. There are many things that might sidetrack through our path, and it was wonderful to work together. Anyway, the floor is yours, Christos.
Thank you, Susi. To those who don't know me, I am Christos Hadjioannou. I'm the other editor of this handbook. So I would like to say hello to everyone and thank you for coming. I am delighted to see this big project come to fruition. The project started about 2.5 years ago when Susi and I decided to edit a volume on phenomenology and mindfulness. I mean, she gave the story before. My starting point is after we had decided that we are going to focus on mindfulness. And also to organize a conference on the same topic at the University of Cyprus. And this conference took place in Cyprus in June 2022. And it was, in my opinion, a huge success. I really enjoyed it. It was a 3-day hybrid conference with some people presenting online, while others presented in person. Not everyone participated in the project. I think the handbook ended up being even bigger than the conference. I would like to also take the opportunity to once again thank the sponsors of that initial event, the Onesilos Fund of the University of Cyprus, the Leventis Foundation, as well as the Deputy Ministry of the Republic of Cyprus. Now, what started as a volume soon developed into something way bigger. Namely, it turned into a special issue with a journal and a whole handbook with 35 chapters and 38 contributors. I must say that when we received all that, so some of the people were invited contributors, some people were, we issued a call for papers and we received a big number of excellent proposals. And then we had this problem, and they were saying with Susi, okay, what do we do? And she said, well, we do something bigger. Let's do a handbook. And I was like, Susi, you're crazy. I don't think we have the energy or the time. Anyway, here we are today. And with this, it's the biggest book I've edited. It was a lot of hard work. The handbook is 543 pages long. It comprises 7 parts. Part 1, which is the biggest, is dedicated to mindfulness in the Western traditions. Part 2 is dedicated to mindfulness in the Eastern traditions. Part 3 is dedicated to ethics and well-being. Part 4 on the topics of time and attention. Part 5 is dedicated to embodiment. Part 6 is dedicated to applications of mindfulness. And finally, part 7 is dedicated to a debate with respect to the limits of the overlap between phenomenology and mindfulness, on the issues of congruence and incongruousness between phenomenology and mindfulness. The handbook provides an overview of the topic of phenomenology and mindfulness with the goal of creating a fruitful dialogue between these two traditions to bring about possible overlaps and incongruities, exploring historical as well as systematic connections. Both phenomenology and mindfulness are inclusively construed in this handbook. Phenomenology is understood as an umbrella term that includes philosophers and approaches that follow from Brentano and Husserl's phenomenological discoveries, extending to and including philosophers that bring together phenomenology with psychoanalysis. For example, we have an original contribution from Luz Irigaray. Mindfulness includes a wide range of conceptions of mindfulness, from Eastern Buddhist-inspired strands of meditation practices and theories to Western Stoic-inspired versions of mindfulness. The fact that at the moment phenomenology of mindfulness is not a classical topic of research, with many new ideas and lines of research being explored, makes this handbook quite different from other traditional reference works that map current research. Instead, this handbook maps uncharted territory, pointing out main problems and directions for future research. So we created this handbook to serve as a reference volume on the phenomenology of mindfulness, to analyze the practice of mindfulness from both subjective and objective perspectives. In fact, the genitive in Handbook of the Phenomenology of Mindfulness is both a subjective and objective genitive. That is, it is a work of phenomenology whose object of analysis is the practice of mindfulness, but it is also about phenomenology being done mindfully. Depending on the perspective and the argument put forward, some chapters shift the emphasis on one side, while others put the emphasis on the other side, while in some chapters the level of overlap between phenomenology and mindfulness is such that the ambiguity dissolves. I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to say anything about my own chapter. I mean, both Susi and I wrote on mindfulness and stoicism. She wrote on Husserl and stoicism. I wrote on Heidegger and stoicism. But because we have a great lineup of speakers who have contributed brilliant chapters in the volume, I will give the floor back to you. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Christos, and thank you, Susi, for your presentation and for introducing the handbook in all this fantastic work. So it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Natalie Depraz and Michel Bitbol, who are among the contributors of the handbook. Natalie?
Yes, thank you very much, Francesca, and also Susi and Christos, of course. And actually with Michel, we decided that Michel will start with a formal presentation, as it's already shown on the screen. And then I will have a smaller amount of time just to comment on it and maybe to provide some extensions. So we will interact. So I give the floor to Michel.
Yes, can you hear me now? Okay. So I didn't know that Jim Morley would be here today, but I entitled my talk with the title of his paper of 2010. It's always about the epoche. What I mean here, it's a little bit different than Jim did in this paper. What I mean is that all the issue of the comparison between mindfulness and phenomenology, or about the application of mindfulness to a good practice of phenomenology, turns around the status of the epoche. And many papers of the handbook actually deal with this issue. So I have no difficulties finding good stuff, even in the handbook, about this issue. So first of all, I will not go very far into the debate that we had with Odysseus Stone and Dan Zahavi, but I must say that the heart of the debate was precisely about the epoche and its status. For instance, in the paper they published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2021, Stone and Zahavi insisted that phenomenology should be understood more in respect to the concept of intentionality than according to the issue of the epoche. And Natalie replied in our paper that in fact it's strange, because intentionality only belongs to the level of the descriptive psychology, while the epoche opens up the true level of transcendental phenomenology. So maybe someone could say, oh yes, but the epoche is only useful for transcendental phenomenology, namely a late part of the work, or relatively late part of the work of Husserl. And by the way, we quoted in the handbook a phrase, a sentence of Husserl in his logical investigations that shows that something like the epoche and the phenomenological reduction was already at work there. Husserl said, the analysis aims to break down the experiences of internal perception by taking them in themselves without taking into account what they signify outside of themselves. Okay, so it's very clear that here in this very early text, Husserl was alluding to something like a precursor of the epoche and a precursor of reduction. So the question whether it is absolutely essential to phenomenology, I think, should be answered in the positive, and therefore one cannot skip the epoche when speaking of phenomenology, and even less when one speaks of the possible connections with mindfulness. Moreover, what is the epoche? It's not very easy to find clear statements in the phenomenological literature, and some authors, such as Stone and Zahavi, says that after all, the epoche is just a bracketing of our prejudices and theoretical assumptions, just an intellectual device to be cool about prejudices, especially theoretical prejudices. We could even say, as Stone and Zahavi say, that the epoche might be only an element in a philosophical reflection, the purpose of which is to liberate us from our natural dogmatism. So just here again, an intellectual tool, nothing more. Okay, but in fact, there are so many arguments that go to the contrary of this very narrow intellectualist conception of the epoche. And Jim says very rightly in his paper of 2010 that, in fact, the epoche is more than an intellectual operation, but is an action involving the entirety of the person in the manner of an ethos. And there are here again plenty of quotations by Husserl, Fink, Levinas, and all these people who say that if the epoche is an existential transformation that involves the whole of the being of the one who is performing it. Husserl, as we know, compared the epoche with a religious conversion, so it's very strong. But at any rate, only in the latter case can a sound comparison between phenomenology and mindfulness be undertaken at the level of practices, and not just at the level of discourses, at the level of so-called philosophical theories that at any rate are all supervenient on the practice, okay? It's impossible to think of either Buddhism or phenomenology, or even, I must say, any branch of philosophy whatsoever that doesn't involve a practice of self-transformation in order to see otherwise, to see things as something else than just common sense or natural attitude. And for instance, in chapter 2 of the handbook, Ming-Hong Chu rightly says that even though phenomenology is in general a theoretical discipline, its coming into effect depends on somebody in the world putting it into practice. Otherwise, the whole transcendental enterprise would float like a castle in the air. Okay, now it's well known that in the phenomenological literature, one lacks a proper methodology of how to perform this epoche. One explanation was given by Natalie in her paper before the handbook. She says that phenomenology is essentially a gnoseological project, a project to found a rigorous science of the essences of experiences, whereas Buddhism has a soteriological end. And therefore, for phenomenology, the Epoche is just an instrument in order to found this rigorous science, whereas the self-transformation of meditation, mindfulness, is something crucial to Buddhism. It must go to the very end of the possibilities of the self-transformation that has been thus initiated. So we are always surprised between the fact that the Epoche is the gateway of transcendental phenomenology and the scarcity of methodological indications for its practice. Is it enough to prescribe verbally a bracketing, a suspension of judgment, an attendance to what Husserl calls the mothers of knowledge below the level of knowledge contents, or to advocate a sudden realization of being despite our everyday attention to beings? Is it enough to say, as Fink would say, that we are free to perform such a gesture? It's very little to as an indication to know how to do, what to do next in order to perform the Epoche. And Ming Hongzhu also very carefully and rightly notices that the issue of knowing whether mindfulness is considered as a potential partner of phenomenology is only because the exact operation of the phenomenological reduction is considered enigmatic. So we need a methodology, and because the methodology is not really taught in the phenomenological texts. And since we need a methodology, we borrow it from Buddhists and say, okay, maybe mindfulness can work as a substitute for this missing methodology. Conversely, the promotion of mindful training in phenomenology shows, says Ming Hongzhu, a sign of optimism, whereby the practical possibility of transcendental research is presupposed. Indeed, there are some people who would say, for instance, maybe some analytic philosophers, who would say, oh, at any rate, this transcendental phenomenology is just a myth. So whatever you do, including mindfulness, is just hopeless. But if we think that transcendental phenomenology is a possible project after all, then practicing mindfulness in order to introduce it could be a good strategy. Now, there is also something strange in the phenomenological literature, especially in Jürgen Fink's characterization of the Epoche and the reduction. It's that, one takes the Epoche and phenomenological reduction in this case as just something that may happen to someone, but without reason, because no reason for performing the Epoche and reduction can be found when we are immersed into the natural attitude. Something completely radically different must erupt within the natural attitude in order to motivate the Epoche. And here I think there is a deep parallel with a debate about mysticism in the 17th century in France between François Fénelon and Jacques Bénigne-Bossuet, because one was saying that God can visit us only when we prepare ourselves with long ascetic practices, whereas the other one said, oh no, by no way, we just have to expect the grace of God to receive his presence, but no need for preparation, no need for spiritual exercise. And again, Fink clearly inclines towards the grace option. It's a sort of paroxysm of the grace option for the Epoche. Indeed, Fink says that there is no compelling motivation for the phenomenological reduction in the natural attitude. The transcendental insights, he said, must flash out as an effect of a phenomenological foreknowledge, as if we had, a vision about what can be a true phenomenology inside this natural attitude, which is completely foreign to the phenomenological attitude. But I wonder, is it a foreknowledge of phenomenology in the natural attitude, or is it memory of what preceded the natural attitude in our early life? This is also a possibility, and the possibility that I would like to develop now by due reference to the Buddhist and also other spiritual literature. Mindfulness is characterized as remembering in the Sanskrit and Pali literature of Buddhism. In Pali, remembering is named sati, and in Sanskrit, remembering is named smriti. But it is also translated, both sati and smriti are both translated as not only memory, but also attention or mindfulness, which is said by Susi Ferrarello in her chapter 5 of the Handbook. So is it that smriti or sati are polysemic words, just that it can mean several things and we don't have to care about all the meanings when we pronounce them? Or is it a relevant component of meaning of mindfulness? Is mindfulness really remembering? And in this case, remembering of what? Well, one possibility is that in order to perform the transition to mindfulness, to a mindful attitude, we have to remove the thoughts we superimpose onto things themselves, as Husserl would say. But I think instead of this characterization of mindfulness as removing our superimposed thoughts on things themselves, I would rather prefer to say that when we perform an act of mindfulness, we are just escaping the stubborn presence of the things themselves in appearance in favor of their thought about and anticipated significance for our future. Namely, we don't see things themselves. We say, oh, they are just signs towards our possible use of them, or our possible going beyond them in the future. So we don't really see things themselves. Compensating for this escape amounts to remembering the forgotten presence of things themselves. So it's really smriti in the proper sense, not just in a metaphorical sense. It's remembering how things themselves are, not what they mean or what they make us think about. To see them as glaring phenomena rather than potential tools for other purposes, or compensating for our forgetfulness of being due to our focus on the utilitarian meaning of beings, as Heidegger would say. Bruce Begu also says in the title of one of his remarkable books that in fact phenomenology is returning to the infancy of the world. So in this case, practicing an act of mindfulness would mean remembering the infancy of the world from which we are cut off. And I find also in other chapters of the handbook some interesting characterization of mindfulness as remembering. For instance, in the paper which is devoted by Marc Applebaum to Sufism, we see that remembering God's universal I beneath the personal ego is precisely what the spiritual practice is about. Remembering that below the level of the daily concerns of a personal ego, we are also a universal I, Atman or Brahman in Sanskrit. Also in Platonism, we find that in order to get some insight into a state that could be called ataraxia, we have to remember our daimon, namely our divine nature, despite our being fallen in a body. So all these examples show that it's not absurd at all to just equate mindfulness with remembering, and not just taking remembering as a metaphor of mindfulness. Also, another argument that advocates in favor of a connection between Buddhism and phenomenology is the recognition by phenomenologists of their being very much close to Buddhism. For instance, Susi quotes in her chapter 5 Eugen Fink, who said that the various phases of Buddhistic self-discipline are essentially phases of phenomenological reduction. So there is no just metaphorical connection or something like that. It's just an identity, an equation between the two elements, just because Eugen Fink recognized something of what he thought has to be practiced to enter into the transcendental phenomenology in the steps of Buddhistic self-discipline. And Husserl also had contradictory characterizations of Buddhism, but some of them tell a story of complicity. For instance, he speaks of Buddhism as a means of seeing, which can be compared with transcendental phenomenology, which is based on a pure seeing rather than bare theorizing. This was also quoted by Susi. And also there is a famous quote in Husserl's preface to a German translation of Sutta Pitaka. He said that Buddhism is probably the highest flower of Indian religiosity, a religiosity which looks purely inward in vision and deed, and which is not transcendent, but transcendental. Here again, Husserl recognizes the kinship between the aim of Buddhism and the result of phenomenology. And also in another paper, Husserl said the following: in contrast to the rationalism of Greek science and an ethic that bases philosophical life on philosophical knowledge, the gaze of the Indian rests on the irrational. Here we have a sort of, distinction. He said, okay, Greek philosophy is rational, Indian thought is irrational. It's probably a prejudice, of course, but then Husserl gives an interesting turn to this distinction and maybe injustice towards Indian philosophy. Yet, he said, there is a way out of this dilemma in transcendentalism. Here, the world is merely a phenomenon for subjectivity. The subject cannot really eliminate the world, but she can turn away from it. She can inhibit the absolute positing of the world. She can refrain from taking it at face value. In each practice of the natural attitude, the world is absolutely posited, and the will wants to enter it, to shape it. But then one may leave the epoche. That's the crucial point, From that moment on, all the contrasts between rationality and irrationality disappear. Phenomenology, just as Buddhism, is a pure seeing, where the distinction between rational and irrational becomes, at least provisionally, irrelevant. Finally, I would like to insist that the comparison between the Epoche and the most advanced steps of the Buddhist practice can only be envisaged if there is a way to go to the very end of the Epoche. In Husserl's phenomenology, in Husserl's version of phenomenology, the Epoche was just a prolegomenon to a limitation of its depth in order to reach a level for description and for founding a rigorous science of the essences of experiences. So it's so the Epoche had to be limited, and Husserl says explicitly the Epoche needs a limitation in order for us to found this science of the essences of experiences. And here, Jan Patočka advocates a completely different attitude. He said, what would happen if we go to the end of the Epoche, if we don't limit it for the sake of, for instance, constituting a domain of objectivity? What would happen if, for instance, if the thesis of the self itself was also subject to the Epoche? If the Epoche was conceived in a completely universal way, nothing is left apart from this gesture of suspension of judgment. The extended Epoche, he says, no longer gives access to some being or pre-being in this case. Not even, the level of pure consciousness that was called a level of absolute being by Husserl is left in this case. The Epoche allows one to have access not to what appears, but to the appearing as such. We bring the appearing to appear, says Patočka, when we perform the Epoche to its end without limiting it. And then he says, what does it bring to perform the Epoche to its end? The Epoche leads all at once to the universal a priori that gives room to appearing for both the experienced thing and the subject of experience, but it doesn't give access to the ground of some absolute being, unlike what Husserl said. Patočka went even as far as saying that the Epoche brought to an end doesn't lead to some absolute being, but to an a priori that can in no way be considered as a being. Okay, it's just a pure receptivity, an empty, pure receptivity. And at this very end of the Epoche, we also recognize some characterizations of the deepest achievements of a spiritual path, such as the Buddhist path. Thank you, and sorry if I've been a little bit long.
Thank you, Michel. I think Natalie can take the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much. So thanks a lot, Michel, for providing us with this very extensive and systematic and very rich understanding of Epoche and of the relationship and the dissolution between theory and practice in the end. So I thought it was a great move to go to maybe what could be called something like nothingness as being the key point where theory and practice stop being different or even contradicting each other, but are actually unified. So it was a great move. Thank you very much. And so I will only make a few comments on along what you said, what you suggested. First, of course, I agree with the fact that the epoche is really the core, and I agree with Jim's title. I think it's a great title. It's really the core of what we have to think about in this issue of how thinking the relation between theory and practice in philosophy and in many other fields, actually. And I think the whole well, I had the volume very late, so I must confess that I didn't have time to go through the articles in great detail, but I went through one or two of them, and through the whole structure as well. And what struck me, and you said it, Christos, I didn't know that the first inspiration was the relationship to stoicism. And well, I didn't know that, but I was struck by the fact that stoicism was very much present in many of the papers, either linked to Husserl or to Heidegger. And that was very interesting for me because I knew a bit about this interaction between Husserl and Buddhism and Stoicism, but I didn't have a lot of indications or informations on this matter. So I think it's a great contribution, I mean, to uncover this basis, this Stoic basis in Husserl and Heidegger. And it brings me to something broader as a comment. Actually, I was, it's also linked to the interaction we had, of course, with Odysseus Stone and Dan Zahavi, and to the reflection, the general reflection that the Western tradition, at least in its modern and contemporary historical periods, in philosophy is a tradition where the embodied basis of experience has been a lot left out, at least before phenomenology, in a sense. I thought it was very interesting to see how on the Buddhist and Indian and spiritual traditions in general, on the one side, and on the side of Stoicism and skepticism on the other side, we had actually two forms, two traditions that were working things differently in the interaction between theory and practice. And I was interested in seeing how these two different traditions, in these two different traditions, one is more, we would say, directly philosophical, Stoicism and skepticism, and it leads to our Western tradition in a sense. And the other line of traditions is more spiritual in the sense that there is no direct philosophical impact, at least in the Western sense of the word. So my reflection was that it's very interesting to have these two leading paths to question the relationship between practice and theory. And the question is ready to ask whether these two lines of thought and practice are exactly the same or similar in their way of doing, or if in Stoicism and skepticism we have already something that will end up in the Western tradition as we know it, as being something more theoretically constructed, let's say. So that's a question I had in mind, and also the fact that as far as Buddhism is concerned, it seems quite obvious that the whole conceptualization which is available in different Buddhist texts, is actually not possible without having been referred to a concrete and situated experience, embodied experience. So the concepts are actually cannot be something else than embodied concepts or concepts directly emerging from an embodied experience. So something that we could call experiential categories or experiential concepts, because they derived from our embodied experience, and they keep the link with the embodied experience. And I think that's very a peculiarity that that got lost actually in the Western modern and contemporary traditions. And I was wondering if actually Stoicism and skepticism were situated exactly on the same line, or were not already bringing something that would lead to this Western conceptualization, which is a bit deprived of its embodied basis. And so I think it's quite interesting to have this kind of triangulation that you have in the book, where these ancient philosophical tradition, let's say, embedded in practice, but also having their own conceptualization on the one side, and then I mean Indian and Buddhist traditions, which are practices and where the embodiment of the experience is the basis for conceptualization. And then thirdly, our modern and contemporary philosophy, which is mainly theoretical, and with the idea that maybe phenomenology is a way to help us come back to this embodied basis, but as a kind of coming back, not as something that is primarily given as a source of embodiment, as it is the case in Buddhist or Indian traditions. So I think your endeavor, I mean, in this whole framework is great, and it comes back to this understanding of epoche as in which sense are we going to take this concept? Is epoche a theoretical justification of knowledge, and is phenomenology a way to bring us back to its embodiment? Is epoche, as in skepticism and stoicism, an ethical move, which is also a conceptualization of this move? And is epoche, if we put it in the mindfulness and awareness paradigm in the contemplative tradition, is epoche far and foremost only a practice, which is then conceptualized from its embodiment? You see, these different moves are not exactly the same. They don't amount to the same, but they may be interesting to take. It may be interesting to take them together and to see how they can circulate from one from another. So, well, that's what I wanted to comment on. I mean, just to follow Michel's proposal and well, to discuss also maybe afterwards. I don't know. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie, for your remarks on Michel's presentation. Thank you very much. So, any questions for our first two speakers?
Maybe a comment, if I can say something.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, just as a comment that I'm not sure where it goes or how it relates to Natalie's points, which are very rich. But what struck me is that lately Stoicism is enjoying this massive rejuvenation. It's become a massive movement globally. But it's not the theoretical part that is the reason behind this. It's as a practical philosophy. that it has become so popular. So there must be something there in Stoicism that allows for this manifestation. On the other hand, I would say that personally, I find this a bit too superficial and a bit to the extent that I find it annoying that the theoretical or the ontological aspects are being totally removed from the Stoic system. So that's just my comment, what comes to mind as in response to Natalie's excellent points. And you've raised so many complicated and interesting issues and ways of charting what's going on in the volume. And maybe if we have a second edition, I already have ideas of what new chapters we could include, for example, based on your comments and the conceptual distinctions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I
Thank
prefer
you.
other people to talk. I mean, we can talk later, maybe.
Yes, if there are no other remarks or question for Natalie and Michel,
I think
would like-
Petri Brencio.
I could
Oh,
ask.
yes, sorry, I didn't see you.
For Michel, I would like to ask, when you were talking about the epoches, that are we able to prepare ourselves for it, or isn't it kind of like a surprise or accident or something that just happens? If we take like mindfulness meditation as an practice of phenomenology in a sense, or guiding some certain kind of guide for what phenomenological epoche could mean, is that in a sense in mindfulness meditation both of these happened. We are able to prepare, but at the same time we are only able to prepare ourselves to a certain point, and then if the real thing happens, that's the experience of grace or the event of grace, because we can't force anything to happen. We can only prepare ourselves by sitting, by breathing, being as attentive as possible. But then the true experience of what, for example, the Buddhists are trying to attain, if you call it nirvana or enlightenment or whatever it is called, or satori or something like this, that you can't force. You can only prepare for it, and then the grace, the event of grace might happen to you if it's gonna happen. So there, then you would have both sides.
You are completely right. Yes, exactly. It's a preparation, and yet any event that could happen after or during this preparation is a complete surprise. But it's not, well, my point in one of the slides, the slides about memory, was that in fact it's not a complete surprise. It's a recognition. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe, well, you can find many texts that say exactly the same. It's memory, it's recognition, it's re-identification of something that was not completely unknown, and so on and so on. And I must say, personally, I had this experience of reconnecting with something that that was there long ago, and that our whole education taught us not to retain and even to be diffident of, So it's not it's a surprise on the one hand, and it's not a complete surprise because it's recognition of something. It's smriti.
Thank you very much. So I would like to move to the other speaker, which is Professor Dermot Moran, and I'm very happy to see you here, Dermot. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca. And of course, I really want to say thank you to Christos and Susi for organizing the conference in Cyprus originally. And then this amazing book. Now, like Natalie, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. It hasn't actually arrived to me. So Michel showed me a copy in Paris, I think, but I haven't personally been able to read it yet. So I'm looking forward to it. But I do think, listening to the introduction by the two editors, that it is really an amazing achievement, because it is the first systematic and historical and intercultural study of mindfulness that I know, and also connecting it very strongly to the phenomenological tradition. And as you know, my contribution in the volume is a discussion about the relationship between Heidegger and Eckhart on the notion of mindfulness. And I'm just going to say a few words on that. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen. It doesn't always work this way, but it's telling me that I have to open system preferences. Let's see if I can share my screen. It's asking me to, for some reason. Oh, for God's sake. It's saying to me that I can't share it because I have to start and restop. That's a nuisance, but let me, I don't have to share it, I'll just read it and talk about it a little bit. What I was going to add here, which is not so much in the chapter that I talked about, is that perhaps the axial point between East and West in terms of the mystical tradition is Meister Eckhart, who is very much a figure who is studied now in Asia, especially in Japan, as a sort of proto-Zen Buddhist. And he was himself obviously a Dominican. He was a Catholic preacher in the tradition of Dionysius and negative theology. So one of the first things that we have to think about is exactly what Christos raised, is that manner in which a practice can be integrated within a particular religious and worldview outlook, and how much it can be separated from that. And that's one of the big debates about how much something like the practice of mindfulness can be distinguished from the very particular manners in which it appeared in Buddhism on the one hand and in the Western Christian tradition on the other. I've been teaching a course recently here at Boston College on the forms of Christian mysticism, largely developing from the Neoplatonic tradition. And I've been arguing that they're a sui generis form of mysticism. Most of my students come in thinking I'm going to talk about Zen Buddhism or Taoism or the Upanishads or something. But in fact, I'm saying, no, there's a tradition in the West. And indeed, the phenomenological tradition grew largely out of that. We saw the reference to Husserl and Buddha, but in fact, there's almost no references, very scattered ones in Shaler and others, to Eastern traditions. And the major work by a phenomenologist, I was going to talk about it in my slide here, was Gerda Walter's 1923 study sur PHENOMENOLOGY der Mystique. And that was really only makes a glancing reference to Meister Eckhart, whom she compares with Buddhism in one sentence. But Heidegger didn't like this book, and he reviewed it. He said it was rubbish, basically, in his Phenomenology of Religious Life lectures. There are remarks, which came out the same year, that he really didn't like her book, but he did think there was a need to explain or explicate the experience of the mystic. And as Michel Bitbol did it, so referenced in one of his quotes, the basic experience is this experience of nothingness. Now, whether that's the experience that motivates the epoche, I don't know, but it's certainly, it is a foundational experience. And something like the experience of nothingness is what opens up the possibility of having something like a relationship to it, some kind of a mindful relation to it. There are many ways of talking about this. Remembrance is one of them. Return is another. But it's also this idea of taking a stance, which Husserl talks a lot about, towards one's natural flow of existence. And this stance taking, Husserl himself describes as a kind of ego splitting. And so, you know, something happens within the self that allows it both to experience its ongoing flow of life, but also to have a sort of detached attitude towards it. And it's this very notion of this gap between our natural life and our perspective on it, and the experience of that gap that I think is the sort of gives us this space or experience of emptiness or nothingness, which allows us then to have a larger reflection on the relation of being and non-being. And in the presentation that I was hoping to show you, but I can't, I have some quotations about the nature of nothingness in the phenomenological tradition. I think actually they talk far more about nothingness than about mindfulness. But there's a way in which nothingness has to be approached that is, of course, referencing the state of mind, which we call mindfulness. But Edith Stein, who never mentions Eckhart, does speak about this experience of what she calls pure being. She's referring to the divine being, but in her Potency and Act from the early 30s, probably 1931, she writes, "Pure being, which has nothing of non-being in itself, is infinite, is eternally infinite, such that no non-being can be before or after it, and it contains in itself all that is and all that can be. This being is, after all, the highest measure of being, or more correctly, it is measureless, it is pure act. In it, nothing is shut, nothing remains unfolded, unentfaltet. It is absolute openness, Erschlossenheit, illuminated in itself and through itself. It is light itself, it is pure spirit." So this is Stein in her religious phase, but it is a reflection very soon after Heidegger's Being and Time, in which she's reflecting on what it is like to have the experience of pure being. And she describes it as pure, absolute openness. And I think that's really, really important, and something that in her review of Heidegger's Being and Time, she criticizes Heidegger for limiting our experience to what she calls finitude, whereas she thinks that the very fact that Heidegger himself mentions that humans have the capacity to transcend themselves already opens up a space which allows for her endless or infinite being, which is sort of convertible with nothingness. And it's exactly that experience, the experience of pure being as being unlimited, and as, if you like, it's as really probably better described as an experience of openness or of nothingness. That's the basis of Meister Eckhart's thought. I don't have time to go into it. As a Dominican, he was very, very aware of Thomas Aquinas's accounts of pure being and the act of being. But his notion of Gelassenheit or releasement is very much an idea of finding a way to experience this being by more or less letting go or releasing oneself into the open. And that phrase of releasing oneself into the open, this is something that one finds also in Heidegger, who, as we all know, was deeply influenced by Meister Eckhart. So I wanted to give you some samples of that, but in the presentation, which I'm happy to send you to share, I go through, as I say, Gerda Walther and Max Scheler both referenced Eckhart, but didn't say much about it. Kata Ultmans, who was a student of Heidegger, wrote an important book on Meister Eckhart in 1935. where she places a great deal of emphasis on Eckhart as a kind of anti-ontotheologist, as it were, because of his ability to have categories that expressed the nature of Dasein's relation to being. People criticized the book as being kind of Heideggerianized Eckhart, but it was very, very important for its day and very important, very much appreciated by Heidegger. He wrote great things about her book. And but later, the last three that I have here, and I'm going to just mention them, is Rainer Schurman, that some of you may know, who wrote a very nice book on Meister Eckhart, Meister Eckhart et la joie errante, in 1972. He was a very important interlocutor between Meister Eckhart and Heidegger in a number of works that he wrote. And I'll just read one of the things he says. He writes in his essay Heidegger and Meister Eckhart on Releasement from 1973. Whenever Heidegger mentions Meister Eckhart, the context is the development of Heidegger's own essential thought. Being that lets beings be, Gelassenheit, the thinging of the thing, understood as the nearing of the world, man's essence, Wesen, needed by being to uphold his truth, and thinking as thanking, the unspoken speech that bestows a world, and last but not least, life without a why, ohne Warum. This is a very condensed paragraph that summarizes at least 5 different elements where Eckhart influenced Heidegger, and the manner in which Eckhart is retrieved, as it were, in Heidegger's thinking about experiencing of the open, Gelassenheit, and so on. And the last two that I refer to in taking up this discussion of Eckhart in relation to phenomenology are Derrida and Jean-Luc Marion, who also have a debate between them as to whether or not the role of negative theology leads one to an experience of a kind of pure nothingness, or whether there is, as Derrida asserts, a kind of super essentiality that is arrived at. In other words, in the passage from being to non-being and then to more than being, or hyperousia, is this a kind of new restoration of being, or is it a further negation of the negation, which is what Derrida wants, and which is in fact what Eckhart himself says. Derrida uses this word denegation, a denegation, a kind of negating of the negation, as being one of the ways of addressing this. So, but that leads me to a kind of personal, I could say more on this, but I'm not going to. But I want to just end with a personal reference here, really, that my own tradition in philosophy, I was student really of Heidegger, or wanted to write my doctorate on Heidegger. The very year I did that, 1976, was the year Heidegger died. And I was told, this is a very dangerous, there's this Gesamtausgabe going to appear and nobody knows what's in it, and it will make all the existing books irrelevant. So if I write on being and time, it won't be very good. 110 volumes later of the Gesamtausgabe, I'm not sure that's true. I still think you can just read Being in Time and find a lot of things in it. But at the time we didn't. So I shifted, and my supervisor wanted me to write on Meister Eckhart. But then I found the philosopher John Scotus Eugena, and he, even perhaps more than Eckhart, was the great apostle, if you like, of God as ultimate nothingness, as God, as Eckhart puts it, as being neither this nor that, but as being profoundly something called omnino nihil, absolute nothingness. So I'm just end with a quote from Eugena about the divine nature. He says, therefore, the divine goodness, regarded as above all things, is said not to be, and to be absolutely nothing. omnino nihil, right? And whoever should look carefully into the words of Saint Dionysius will find that this is their meaning. And so he goes on to talk about the experience of this nothingness as being a way of transcending, our locatedness in the world of the creature, or in the world of the finitude, or of the world of restricted, to use the phenomenological language, natural attitude. So the idea that I've been sort of progressively sort of studying over at this stage now, 40 years or so, has been this experience of nothingness, which I do think is central to the experience of mindfulness. So I'm sort of focusing more on that side than on the attitude we should take towards it, which is, of course, called detachment or releasement. It could also be serenité, which is the translation of serenity, the translation of Rainer Schurman. But I think the whole area needs a much deeper going through. But what I'm trying to do, at least these days, is to emphasize what I call the sui generis Western tradition, which of course must have had roots back into the Sanskrit and through the Persian and so on. And later, since the 19th century, has connections to the Buddhist and to the Taoist and other traditions, but which had its own solid 2,000 years of development, which has its own categories. So, I find that really fascinating in terms of the history of the evolution of the notion of mindfulness. Okay, thank you. And I apologize, I couldn't get my slideshow working.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dermot. Any question for our guest?
Michel has his hand up, I think, or he did. Yeah.
I'm checking if anyone is raising the virtual hand, but I'm not able to see anybody. So if there is no question for Professor Moran, I will give the floor to...
There is nobody else.
No, yes, here it is, Michel. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Dermot. I'm really fascinated that, in the two authors you quoted extensively, namely Eckhart and John Scotus Erigena. And I was wondering, for instance, when Scotus Erigena alludes to his conception of God as absolute nothingness, does he connect that to anything like a personal experience or a spiritual exercise or something like that?
Yes, I mean, very much so. For Eckhart, the opposite side is exactly what we were discussing earlier, which in fact Petri raised, was this relationship of being prepared or open, to allow the experience to happen. And one of the ways in which we do this, let's say for Erigena first, is that Erigena thinks that the experience of nature his whole book is called On the Divisions of Nature, and the experience of nature in its many forms is our total experience. But nature has different levels. And one of the ways that we come to recognize the truth, as it were, is to experience everything as what he calls the theophania, or as a manifestation of the divine. And it is Erigena that has this phrase, which he takes from the Bible, that every gift is a grace, basically, or omni donum datum est, or omni datum donum est. Sorry, everything given is a gift. In other words, everything that is experienced in Gegebenheit can be understood as to use the phrase of Marion, donation. And in fact, that's precisely what Marion does, is to open up the idea so that the experience of being is always an experience of this excess that cannot be categorized in objectifying language. And so we have to have a kind of openness to experience things as having an excess or a superfluity that takes us beyond their apparent natures to their deeper nature. Of course, doing that for oneself is to find this deeper ground that you mentioned yourself beneath the sort of everyday practical self. But that ground is always conceived as an Abgrund, also as a kind of an abyss or an emptiness that is much deeper, you know. And the ground of the soul in Eckhart is a reference to that very experience, which is a kind of universal, and perhaps it's a bit difficult to say whether it's an undifferentiated self, if you like, if it's a kind of universal self, which is, you know, at its deepest point, not distinct from the divine nature. That's the thought in Eckhart. That was what he was accused of saying, you know, accused of heresy from that point, because of the merging of the self with the divine self at the deepest ground of the self.
Thank you. Thank you, Dermot.
Jim, you would like to say something? I saw you moving your hand. Not sure.
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly, not a very philosophical point, but one of the things that so delighted me about this volume was the emphasis on what I'll call the indigenous Western mindfulness tradition, that Europe has its own traditions that were snuffed out with the industrialization. We were the first culture to actually take on the natural attitude on steroids, so to speak, which is what you could call naturalism. And we wiped out our monastic and meditative traditions. And I just was very encouraged to see that so many of the papers were directed towards the resuscitation of traditions that are also that have been longer present, that are our own, that are there to be taken up. And just my other point is that I've been really moved by the work of a historian, an archaeologist actually, named McEvely, who about 15 years ago published a book that absolutely nails it with archaeological evidence about the interflow between the Indian and the Persian and the Greco-Roman world. And he makes the case that the so-called severance between East and West is an artificial construction of British colonialism. Before that, there really wasn't that big a gap. And the Crusades, of course, were all about that fusion of culture, especially spiritual traditions. So anyway, it's just a nascent theme to all these articles. And I just am very encouraged to see the emphasis on the Western tradition as well, not just going to the East. And also the idea of grafting what we lost with what's still alive with Asian thought, that the idea that we can't be Asians, but we can graft what their practices and maybe bring to light the practices that we already have and sort of resuscitate our own traditions. That's a great hope here with contemplative phenomenology, and I'm just very encouraged to see that. Anyway, thanks. That's all I had to say. Thank you, everybody. It's really great to be here.
Susi, you would like to add something?
Yeah, I was just about to put it in the chat because I don't want to take more time from these great presentations. But yeah, what Jim said resonated a lot with what is written in this book, Being Place. The last chapters are really his attempt, and my pronunciation is terrible, so I don't dare to pronounce his name. But it's really an attempt to encourage us to translate what he tried to call mindfulness, but he was a little uncertain about, into our way of living it. So yeah, it's resonating now, and it's a good teaching to learn. Anyway, just that. Thanks, Francesca, and thanks, Jim.
Thank you. So I'm happy now to give the floor to Marc Applebaum.
Great. So happy to be here with all of you, and big thanks to Francesca for hosting this, and really a debt of gratitude to Susi and Christos for putting in the tremendous amount of work that it took to put together this volume. Really something unique. So to begin with, as some of you know, I teach qualitative research in psychology, specifically existential phenomenological research. And I've also been engaged in the theoretical and practical study of meditative remembrance in Sufism. That's the meditative path rooted in Islam for nearly 3 decades. So for me, I see meditative practice and phenomenology as living explorations of consciousness that are mutually enriching. And my aim in this chapter was to bridge these 2 domains. So as is mentioned in a few chapters, I think, like Susi's, the word mindfulness was first used in the 19th century by Rice David to translate the Pali Theravadan Buddhist term sati, which literally means remembering. And in my chapter, I situate mindfulness within traditional Buddhist and Sufi practices. And in Sufism, likewise, the Arabic word for remembrance refers to meditation. So we have a great commonality there. I share in the chapter descriptions of meditative experience from long-term practitioners in a traditionally authorized Sufi group, and explain them in a way that is particularly informed by Husserl and Fink's phenomenology. So in the chapter, I'm seeking to exemplify a phenomenological human scientific understanding of what occurs in depth meditation. And in this context, phenomenology enables us to bracket the Sufism's theological and ontological presuppositions in order to clarify in a more essential way the meanings of life-changing shifts in meditators' experience of selfhood and self-other relations. It's important to highlight the differences between the aims of mindfulness practice in Theravada Buddhism and the way those practices have been adapted and popularized in the West. To generalize a bit, in Western individualist societies, mindfulness has increasingly been framed as a technique to improve the quality of one's already existing life by putting the practitioner in a more wakeful, felt contact with themselves, with others, with their surrounding world, in a way that yields an increased present-centeredness and a greater sense of well-being. And these outcomes are undeniably health-giving. At the same time, they represent what a scholar of Buddhism, Alexander Wynne, described as an enhanced version of mundane experience. That is, they're aimed, you could say, at enriching the life of a subject whose center of gravity remains in the natural attitude of everyday life. But in contrast, in Buddhist or Akbari spiritual paths in Sufism, meditation is framed as a journey to the very root of one's moment-to-moment consciousness. And that journey, which is lifelong, is intended to make one disposable to an event in which one's sense of being the owner of a factical, bounded personal identity is substantially effaced, at least in a transitory way. So for both traditions, this rupture with the natural attitude sense of oneself is an important milestone in the meditative path. And that's a thoroughly experiential claim, the way I hear it. So I wanted to examine meditators' descriptions of occurrences on the way to that reported transformation and effacement. Today, Buddhism is often associated with meditation. But for most of Buddhism's history, meditation was practiced almost exclusively by a comparatively small number of men or women who dedicated themselves to a monastic path. In the early 20th century, Theravada reformers began to simplify and popularize meditative practices for lay Buddhists, and it's those which were then spread to the West. Even so, it's still a minority of people in majority Buddhist societies who would practice meditation in a dedicated lifelong fashion. And similarly, through the history of Islam, there have been a wide range of devotional practices, such as vocal or musical forms of remembering God. But comparatively few have engaged in the disciplined meditative practice known as silent remembrance. In Arabic, that would be zikri qalbi, or remembrance of the heart, literally, associated with the inheritors of the 13th century mystic Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, and it's that tradition with which I'm concerned. This practice of remembrance of the heart aims at deeply internalizing remembrance in meditation, and it's said to yield profound shifts in the practitioner's sense of ownership of their actions, of their attributes, and selfhood. This is followed by a reintegration into individuated life in the world, but in a significantly altered way. So while both Theravada Buddhist and Sufi mindfulness cultivate a witnessing regard through which one's egocentric attachments are recognized and gradually loosened, their understanding of selfhood are fundamentally different. In the main, Buddhism advocates a doctrine of non-self, anatman or anatta in Pali, which claims that humans have no bounded enduring self. Rather, they're a locus of spacious awareness. As such, we could say, individual selfhood being a kind of illusory misperception. The scholar of Theravada, Miri al-Bahari, explained the meditative aim in this case is, in her words, the first-person realization that there is no self. So in contrast, Sufism, like all the three Abrahamic faiths, claims that there's a kind of enduring individuated selfhood, which in some fashion precedes embodied life and survives the death of the physical body. Akbari Sufism regards each human as a locus for divine self-manifestation, a unique place within which the one, in Neoplatonic terms, right, manifests in the field of multiplicity. From this perspective, one's individual selfhood is a moment-to-moment endowment from God to each person, who's in a constant state of intimate relatedness with their divine source. Humans are envisioned as having a condition of servanthood and ontological indigence in relation to God as their life-giving home ground. So meditation in this picture is aimed at living through the discovery through a progressive disidentification that the source of one's I-ness is that unitive divinity, but that nevertheless one functionally is a unique, contingent, and limited being with, in Ibn al-Arabi's terms, a specific face that faces the divine face. So both Theravada and Akbari Sufism claim that the discovery of a kind of emptiness is found at the core of the I who one takes oneself to be in the natural attitude. However, in Sufism, individuated human selfhood persists, but its radical contingency and intimate reliance on its source is revealed and renewed in the interest of ongoing character refinement and completion. So that's kind of a big picture of the aim of meditative remembrance. So now turning to descriptions, what do people actually describe in terms of meditation? To be clear, the descriptions that I worked with were all from people who, within an Akbari interpretive framework, would be thought of as exemplifying various stages of approaching that decisive passing away of the sense of a strictly bounded self. For me, as a phenomenologist, of course, the theological or ontological claims, as well as the interpretive map of spiritual states and stations in this tradition, would be understood as the tradition's hermeneutic and are held within brackets. So in the chapter, I seek to describe and more essentially articulate the structure of these experiences as they present themselves to meditators. And in turning to the descriptions of meditation, it's important to acknowledge that there's a robust literature in psychology on psychopathological experiences that can occur when people who lack what we could call adequate psychological integrity or ego strength too rapidly propel themselves into experiences of fragmentation, dissociation, or destabilizing depersonalization, for example, through prolonged meditative retreats. And that's one of the reasons that traditionally meditation in Sufism is pursued under the supervision of an authorized guide. That's precisely to safeguard against potential destabilization along the way. So that said, what did the meditators report? There were three people that you'll see in the chapter. The first was the youngest and relatively less experienced in meditation, and he reported a loosening of attachment to his everyday sense of selfhood. In Husserl's terms, I would relate that to I, the man, that sense of self. As he, the meditator, begins to discover a shift to a more relaxed, witnessing regard while sitting in meditation. And this loosening was accompanied for him by a fluctuating sense of excitement on the one hand and faint anxiety on the other, particularly when he imagined he might collapse into a negative emptiness or loss of himself. Not untypical. So rather than being deeply upsetting, however, these conscious contents were all held within awareness by him. And what began to emerge was a new sense of relaxed, vigilant awareness from a discovered vantage point which was not yet familiar to him, as it was distinct from the personal or psychical level, in Husserl's terms, of his ego. So that's the first person. So the second practitioner reported his meditative experience deepening. This is a longer-term practitioner, to the point where altered states began to manifest in the midst of daily activity. The example given in the chapter was what Sufis would call the effacement of actions. So in the midst of daily activity, he reports stirring a cup of coffee while in a conversation in a cafe, and describes recognizing in an undoubtable felt way that while he was participating in the act of stirring, it was not actually he who was the owner of the action of stirring the coffee. And rather than this being a troubling or dissociative experience for him, it was a quietly euphoric, expansive one, in which there was a sense of interconnection and joy in relation to the person with whom he was having coffee and talking, and with the whole surrounding environment, so there was still a preserving of relative self-other distinctions given in that experience. And one could say that in Husserlian terms, this person is experiencing themselves as participating in the I can, rather than being the owner or the comprehensive central agent of the I can. This experience of the person recognizing themselves as a participant in their actions rather than the owner foreshadows or anticipates the thinning of one's habitual sense of owning one's I, one's own I-ness. And this further territory begins to appear in the interview with the third meditator. She described merging with an all-inclusive and seemingly cosmic sense of I-ness, which she named the presence. For her, there was an experience of coming in and out of finding herself locatable as the perceiver, and then being as if held by that I that transcended and included and seemed to be perceiving her. She describes her everyday sense of identity as seeming to have fallen off, in her words, but yet still finding herself as a personal locus relating to that presence, which felt to her like an accompanying friend, and then feeling absorbed in that presence. The first shift in which her everyday sense of self seemed to fall off can be interpreted as a shift in the locus of identity from the personal ego of the natural attitude to a more transcendental layer of ego. And the sense of alternatingly being accompanied by a larger encompassing presence is a further retracing of that sort of constitutive flow of consciousness, in the context of which she experiences a loving friendship to this primordial origin of her I-ness itself in that unitive friend. I wanted to mention that James Hart wrote that in Husserl's work, and this is a quote, "There's an ineluctable self-presence in primal presencing's self-communalization, and that this is ambiguously egological." Unquote. That self-presencing, I would say, seems to constitute the personal me and return one to oneself, as classic descriptions from Sufism often state, being returned to oneself after union. So this last meditator's description of a presence that she felt to be her origin and her home ground, I would say points strongly in this direction. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marc, for your presentation. So let's open the floor for the questions. If there is no question, no remark for our guest, I'm going to thank Marc once again for his presentation. And
we have one, Francesca, sorry.
Okay, I'm not able to see. That's quite tricky. Yeah.
I can't find my hand button.
No, it's okay.
Anyway, thank you very much, Marc. That was wonderful. And I just wanted to comment on your remark about the Sufi tradition, about, which retains a sense of self. This is exactly, and in the Arabic tradition also, this is exactly it gets transported into the Western European tradition in the debate between the Averroes and if you like others, because the Averroes, had the idea of a single universal soul, shared by all human beings, and Thomas and others argued for the individual self. But when it gets to mysticism, it gets more complicated, because precisely as the self, shall we say, enlarges or becomes more freed of its earthly attachments, it becomes merges into the kind of universal self. So the debate that goes on all the time is whether Buddhism has no self-doctrine or self-doctrine. This is the same debate within, I think, nearly every version of mysticism. And I just wanted to say that your remarks were very, very helpful in giving yet another context for that tension.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think for a phenomenological study of Sufism or any of the other traditions you mentioned, it becomes really just a fascinating question. What is the form of the self that's being described here? What are its limits? What sense of identity is there? It's well, more to be said, but thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Diego D'Angelo. Hi, Diego.
Hi, Francesca. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for hosting this presentation. And obviously, many thanks again to Susi and Christos for putting together this marvelous work and for having me contributing to it. I'll try to share my screen. I hope to have more luck than Dermot so that you can see my presentation. Entering full screen. Are you seeing my slides? Okay. Great.
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. So I try to keep it fairly short. I will try to give you an overview of what I was trying to do in my contribution with some additional thoughts that came to me upon reading some of the other contributions from the handbook. And my presentation is probably going in a direction which is a little bit different from the presentations up to this point. I'm not going into more of a kind of historical discussion of philosophy or into the question of the relation between philosophy or phenomenology and mindfulness and other traditions. What I will try to do is, if you want, very, very basic and maybe not so interesting at all, I will try to sketch out a couple of aspects that seem to me to be related to the concept of mindfulness. And I will try to argue that I think the concept of mindfulness can be used helpfully in order to describe certain kinds of everyday experiences. That's the reason why I titled my presentation Experiential Mindfulness, a Phenomenological Perspective. Just to give you very briefly the aims of the presentation, in the first part, I will try to provide some conceptual differentiations concerning attention and mindfulness. And on the second part, I will try to propose a definition for experiential mindfulness as a kind of open and reflexive attention. And I will try to describe some of its basic phenomenological traits. Basically, I have the impression that the term mindfulness is used in literature as an umbrella term if you want to describe very different things. Indeed, you can use the term mindfulness as a kind of character trait, as a kind of capacity, as a kind of attitude, as a kind of course, meditational exercise, as a particular aspect of experience. And what I would try to do is focus on this last point, these very particular kind of experiences that we can call mindfulness experiences. So the two parts. First of all, I will explain what my concept of mindfulness, which is really only my personal understanding of it, is not. I will not discuss meditational practices. I will not discuss mindfulness as a trait, as a disposition, or as a capacity. I will focus on mindful experiences. And as I said in the second part, I will try to give a characterization of this phenomenological concept. I will try to characterize mindfulness as a form of open and reflective attentional experience. I will further characterize the openness of mindful experiences along three axes: horizontality or horizonality, non-judgmentality, and emotional steadiness. And in the very last part of the talk, I will focus on this concept of reflectiveness, and I will explain that I think the best way to understand this concept in this context is as a kind of knowledge about one's own experience. So let me start by explaining to you what I mean by mindful experiences. I think that it is possible to find examples for mindfulness experiences also in our everyday lives. That means decoupled from meditational practices. And I think a first, and I hope a good illustration of the kind of experiences designated by the term mindfulness is provided by a literary example, which is included in the very first novel written by one of my favorite novelists, Iris Murdoch. In her first novel, Under the Net, she gives a fascinating example of a special kind of attentive experience. Consider the following situation. Jake is the main figure of the novel. He goes to a pub and immerses himself in intense brooding about the events of the past days, about his relation to his friend Finn, his relation to his girlfriend Anna, and to what to do next. This is the way in which Iris Murdoch describes masterfully this scene. Let me quote from Under the Net. "At last the pubs opened. I had a drink. It occurred to me that I had something to say to Dave," which is a friend of Jake, "after all, which was to ask whether there was any news of Finn. My need of Finn began to be very great, and I had to force my attention away from it. I had some more drinks. The time passed slowly. During this time, I didn't at first think of anything special. There was too much to think about. I just sat quietly and let things take shape deeply within me. I could just sense the great forms moving in the darkness, beneath the level of my attention and without my aid, until gradually I began to see where I was. My memories of Anna, which is her girlfriend, had been completely transformed. Into each one of them, a new dimension has been introduced." And I think in this quote, you can already see some of the main aspects of mindfulness, which that have been also discussed today, such as the role of memory and remembrances, the role of attention. I will obviously only go into some details of this example. So we have an experience, obviously, from the first-person perspective of Jake sitting in the pub and first, if you want, emptying his mind, yes, well, also with the help of a pint of beer, why not? He tries to free his mind from what occupies him in the first place, that is, the thought of his friend Finn. Jake has to force his attention away from that thought. When this happens, time starts to pass very slowly, and he is not thinking of anything special. He has emptied his mind, if you want. He is now able to elude rumination. He is sitting quietly, and we could add to Murdoch's description, having managed to empty his own attention, he is now open to something, and I quote, beneath the level of his attention. That means, in the way I am understanding this description, that he is non-judgmentally aware of himself and his surrounding is just in the present moment. Not just metaphorically, but very concretely, Jake now realizes where he is at, that is, in the pub, thinking about his life. He is now fully mindful of the present moment, of his being in the pub, and his attention, it may be directed at a center of focus, such as the pint of beer in front of him, but his focus would not impede openness to other things and events in the scene. This sense of appreciation for the present moment and for being in the present moment is connected to a kind of relaxed attitude towards the world, in which Jake is immersed without prejudices and without the need to constantly evaluate the present situation, as we usually do in everyday contexts for, you know, every kind of instrumental reasons, moral reason, and everything else. Through this open and reflective attention, Jake comes to realize that he should think of Anna, his girlfriend, in another, more mature way in order to save his relationship. So, what is actually experiential mindfulness if we stick to this example and to similar experiences? In literature, the term mindfulness refers usually both to the state of being mindful and to mindful meditation. As all of you probably know very well, you can quote, for example, the work of Kabat-Zinn on mindfulness. He has many definitions. I choose one for this presentation. He says mindfulness has to do with particular qualities of attention and awareness that can be cultivated and developed through meditation. The interesting point for me is that the term mindfulness is sometimes used in an unclear way in scholarship by terming the phenomenon I am concerned with experiential mindfulness. I aim to avoid this kind of equivocation. Is mindfulness referring to a quality of experience or to something we can achieve through mindfulness? Yes, through meditation, or both of them? Can we make some kind of differentiations? By making this conceptual differentiation, I really do not mean that experiential mindfulness is to be completely decoupled from mindful meditation. I would argue that mindfulness meditation often ends up or aims at a kind of mindful experience. What I am to do is just narrower in the scopus. I just want to focus on the experience itself without going through meditation itself, if it is possible, and this is for me also an open question. Yes, I was already said this one, so I will go to the next slide. As I said, experiential mindfulness is not a capacity, a trait, or a disposition. We have, for example, in broad parts of psychological and neuroscientific research, this idea that mindfulness is some kind of character trait or disposition or capacity that we have. One definition that I picked out for this presentation has been given by Tangerholzer and Posner in 2016, and it reads as follows: mindfulness is a trait that is usually assessed through self-report questionnaires, such as the Mindful Attention Awareness Scale, the Kentucky Inventory of Mindfulness Skills, or 5-facet mindfulness questionnaires. So as you can see, it is obviously treated as a trait, as a skill that can be at least approached in some way via questionnaires. So definitely a very different understanding from what, for example, Kabat-Zinn was suggesting. Also, but even in this case, mindfulness remains an equivocal concept. A mindful state, of course, or a mindful disposition is not necessarily the same thing as mindfulness as a character trait that can be assessed through questionnaires. Just to give a very summary differentiation, of course, mindfulness as a trait or disposition is independent from the concrete singular experience I am having in this moment. I can be distracted at this moment and still think about myself as a mindful person. On the other hand, of course, I can have a mindful experience in this very moment, even if I would usually describe myself as a not very mindful person. So I think there is some work to be done here in order to differentiate different kinds and different references that are usually coupled with the term mindfulness. As I said, my focus is very narrow. Mindful experiences, that means experiences that we would describe in everyday contexts as mindful experiences. The first example I gave to you was from Iris Murdoch. And now, in order to come to the more systematic part of the presentation, let me give you another example, one that I developed myself. Let's say you take a walk in the forest or in the fields as a break from everyday stress. You enjoy the calmness of nature, the trees, and you are happy when you encounter a squirrel or a bird. Of course, you're not a botanist or an ornithologist. You don't have any kind of specialized interest in the bird or in the trees. When a blackbird crosses the street in front of you, you smile because you appreciate the beauty of the bird, but you are not interested in determining the age of the bird, its sex, or studying its behavior. You are just appreciating the beauty of it all. Your attention is in such situations not necessarily focused on individual things in your environment. You are just taking a stroll. You are taking in, the environment, the surrounding fields, the surrounding meadows, or the forest in which you are walking. You can obviously focus briefly on specific elements, just like the black bird crossing the path, but you're not really concentrating on anything in particular. Instead, you are absorbing the impressions from the setting as a whole, as a holistic experience, if you want. In this situation, the subject is, I think, completely immersed in the landscape, in the activity, and this is evidenced in some phenomenological way by the fact that you are able to enjoy the experience you have. You have the feeling, you have the impression, you have the Erlebnis, if you want, that you are walking in the fields, that you are attuned to the landscape in order to, being able to enjoy it. And you must, of course, put aside, for example, your own work-related worries or family problems in order to really be able to enjoy the landscape and to focus on the present moment. What I think is interesting about this kind of examples is, though, that you don't only need to be aware of your surroundings, of the trees and plants and birds. You are not only open and receptive to everything that happens right here and right now in the forest. Indeed, you are enjoying yourself, and you are relaxing yourself, and furthermore, you know about this. You know that you are enjoying yourself, you know that you are taking a break, you know that whatever works for you in that situation. While walking around and taking in the landscape, you are consciously aware that you are here, that you are having a good time, even if you are not paying attention to one single object, one single aspect of the scene. There is a clear awareness of your surroundings that makes it possible for you to consciously enjoy the walk. As most of us, I think, know, the result of such experiences of everyday mindfulness is not only a general, sense of relaxation. Indeed, as Murdoch was making clear in the novel, they really help us put things in perspective, as we usually in everyday contexts would say. We put things in perspective and we clear our minds in such a way that we can have new ideas and new thoughts that are even in sometimes life-changing, just as in the case of Iris Murdoch's novel. I think these are relatively commonsensical examples. The walk in the forest, Jake, clearing his mind with a pint of beer. But they show that these kind of everyday mindful experiences can be roughly understood as a kind of attentive experiences in which attention plays a crucial role, but also as experiences in which we are not really taken in by something very specific, by a concrete object, by a concrete person, by a concrete thought, but these are experiences rather in which we are open to what happens to us. And I think this is one of the ways. I still have Helga on the slide. I noticed just now this was just my example, and then I reframed it for the presentation in a you talk. But that's what I'm referring to, the experiences of taking a stroll in the park. I think that these descriptions can help us in fleshing out some characteristics of these experiences as some kind of open and reflexive attention. As I said, all these examples involve some kind of attentive, attentional experience. And I think the form of attention that is involved is open and reflective. Why open? Well, because, as I said, we are not really focusing on one single object, one single person, or one single thought, but rather we are experiencing a form of immersive attention an immersion that can be in our surroundings as a whole, to what is happening in the world we live in at the present moment, always without being focused on a particular object or on a particular task. But of course, not every form of open attention is ipso facto a form of mindfulness. Taking a stroll in the park and paying attention to the beauty of nature is not automatically an experience of mindfulness if we do not also add the concomitant act of paying attention to oneself and to one's own experience of precisely having this very experience. That's the reason why I think that we need reflexivity. But before we go to reflexivity, let me spell out more concretely more completely and very quickly, three basic traits of open attention. I think that the openness of mindful attention manifests in our experience in situations that we would describe as being marked by a certain awareness of the whole situation. And this is precisely the aspect that I try to mark as the horizontality of experience. We live in the present moment, in the wholeness of the present moment. Attention does not jump from one object to another in a frantic and chaotic manner, restless and scattered, as it often is in everyday experiences, but rather it remains immersed in the entirety of the situation. We experience, for example, the park where we are taking the stroll, along with the weather, the people we passed by, the dogs barking in the distance, the woodpecker pecking at the tree in front of us, and so forth. And I think that we can frame this characteristic of open attention and as its originality. Yes. Secondly, open attention is not judgmental. The experience of mindfulness implies phenomenologically suspending the judgment related to the current experience. I'm not trying to evaluate what I'm doing. Am I wasting my time? Should I be working or whatever? I just do what I am doing. I let aside value, moral, and epistemic judgments in order to embrace my own experience and the surrounding world. The last aspect is, I think, some kind of condition in order to have mindful experiences. We have to have a state of mind of a specific nature. I think it is impossible, mostly at least impossible, to experience mindfulness while feeling angry or overwhelmingly sad. All these emotional experiences will have the focus directed towards a single object that grasps our attention. Strong emotions require our undivided attention, diverting it from the horizons of our experience. And that's the reason why I think that some kind of emotional steadiness is required in order to have mindful experiences. I'm coming to a conclusion by singling out the last aspect. There are obviously much more than this. The last aspect I'm going to focus on of mindful experiences. These are experiences in which the subject knows about one's own or her own experience. What is peculiar to mindfulness states is the status of this knowledge. It is not purely, some kind of introspective knowledge, but precisely because of the dissolution, of the kind of dissolution that we experience between inner and outer world. It is a kind of merging of living in the present moment, of being outside of oneself in the surrounding world. Precisely because of this, the subject of mindful experience knows that she's having this very experience of this very world just in the moment in which she is having this experience. So it's a very peculiar kind of reflexivity that doesn't need a kind of time difference or a kind of introspective stance directed to oneself. It's just an immediate reflexive knowledge. Of course, in the paper I spell out all these characteristics more deeply. I'm just trying to give you the gist of my ideas. So just to conclude, And to wrap things up, in my paper, I tried to review some current research on mindfulness in order to introduce some conceptual distinctions that make a more clear-cut phenomenology of mindful experiences possible. First, I distinguish mindful experiences from mindfulness meditation, and secondly, I distinguish it from mindfulness as a trait, a disposition, or a capacity. And then by looking at an example from literature and at one from everyday experience, I try to spell out a definition of mindful experience. An experience can be described as mindful if the subject is openly attentive to our surroundings while at the same time taking a reflective stance. Furthermore, I characterized open attention experiences, of which mindfulness is therefore a subclass, along 3 axes: originality, non-judgmentality, and emotional steadiness. The reflective stance, in turn, has been characterized as knowledge about one's own experiences. Of course, this is just a first cartography of mindful experiences and concepts from a phenomenological perspective. Many questions remain to be asked. For example, questions concerning the exact epistemic status of knowledge about one's own experiences, but also more generally, how can we further analyze phenomenologically the structures of everyday mindful experiences? And I'm very much looking forward to any other questions that could come out in the discussion. Thank you again for having me here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Diego, for your very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. So let's open the floor for the questions or any remark to our speaker. I'm trying to see if anybody is using the virtual hand. So if just someone would like to say something, please open the microphone, because I don't want to lose the possibility to talk for you.
I think Jim wanted the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes, may I? Yeah, Diego, I was very excited about your submission to the volume and your work. You're taking a very unique approach. You're being very phenomenological in the sense you're looking at how mindfulness emerges in everyday life without the category of meditation or even philosophical reflection. You're just looking at how it emerges almost within the natural attitude. It just can pop up. Like, and the literary example you gave was very good. The guy's sitting at the pub and he has a reflection and his life changes from that. And it's a nice sort of mundane example of what we've been calling grace, dangerously, because it's so mixed up with so many religious concepts. Very similar to also what we all called an everyday epiphany, So I really enjoyed it very much. And of course, forgive me, I was being selfish. I was thinking my own work with daydreaming. And I was realizing that much of what you were saying complemented, illuminated my own work on daydreaming. So I'm going to be stealing from you in the future, and I promise to cite you. It's a really, really helpful way of looking at this without recourse to philosophy or religious or meditation techniques. Just straightly, what's the experience? There's lots of questions, though. So this level of reflection that comes naturally without invoking. It just comes. And what are the events that have propped it up? One thing I've just mentioned is that the American humanistic psychologists would often call this a peak experience. It's something that will be great interest to you. Abraham Maslow is the psychologist who's famous for studying this. Peak experiences that just come along and change your life. But I also want to say, would you include daydreaming as part of this? There's not all daydreams are mindful, mind you, but there's an element of mindfulness, I argue, that's there with all daydreams.
Yes.
And what would you say about that?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Great question, and I'm obviously very happy that you find my account in some way interesting. Yes, I mean, just in order to give you a broader context of what I'm doing, this work on mindfulness as open attention is coming out from a book I'm writing in German, and in the book I also have a chapter on daydreaming. Interestingly, unfortunately, at the present moment it is still only in German, but I plan to translate it at some point, and will be happy to forward it to you. I have the impression that there are, of course, many ways of speaking about daydreaming in current research. What I think is really interesting, a newer approach that's try to suggest that daydreaming is not, some state in which we are not attentive to anything at all, which is a kind of antiquate account of daydreaming, but we are obviously attentive, in some cases very attentive to our own daydreaming, and this is precisely the reason why daydreaming can have serious consequences for the way in which we live our lives, and for different things and thoughts. And the question that interests me is precisely what kind of attention do we have when we are experiencing daydreaming. I would suggest that we can differentiate many different kinds of attentional experiences, and of course I would try to differentiate between paying attention to the screen of your computer while you are writing a presentation for the next conference, and the kind of attention you have in daydreaming is just felt differently on a very, very everyday level. And I think in daydreaming you can really use this concept of open attention. It would be interesting to know if you would be, I don't know how to exactly frame it, as if you would use the concept of reflective attention in daydreaming. Because I think in daydreaming there is a kind of experience of abandoning oneself to one's own, dreams or train of thought, or whatever you want to call them. So maybe it's not reflective. On the other hand, we are mostly aware of the fact that we are daydreaming. But what I would suggest is that with this open attention, you are not doing anything. It's just coming to you in a way, and that's the reason why it can impact you so much. I don't know if you can, if you can do something with my kind of suggestions and ideas.
No, we're both pointing at a very similar latency in our own interests. I interview people on their daydreams and come up with exactly what you described here.
Oh, so nice.
We're encountering the same phenomenon in parallel ways, and supporting one another. Yeah, people actually describe, I use the word lucidity. There's a lucidity at the core of every daydream, where the person is aware of themselves as daydreamer and as person being daydreamed. And they're both there. And ordinary people describe this, if you can get into the right interview mode with them. It just intrigues me. So that was my contribution to the volume, something very close to what you're talking about here. Indeed. So we should talk. Yeah, it's very close.
Yeah, nice. Thank you very much. We should. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, about your comments on Diego's presentation. So our very last speaker is Kurt Mertel, right?
Yes.
Thank you for being with us, Kurt. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Thanks, first of all, to Susi and Christos for, again, putting together this amazing volume and giving me the opportunity to contribute to it. And thank you, of course, to Francesca for graciously hosting this event as well. I should say that before I start that my co-author, Samuel White, unfortunately could not join us today, so I'll be presenting on his behalf as well. So the paper is titled Deconstructing Mindfulness, Heidegger, Tanabe, and the Kyoto School. So as part of a broader trend of mobilizing terminology from phenomenological and contemplative traditions in the service of the self-help industry, mindfulness has become to be understood as a technology for self-cultivation in the pursuit of health, wellness, and productivity. Such an understanding and utilization of mindfulness reduces its function to a form of productivism designed to generate an ideal form of subjectivity. In response to this trend, it is worth pursuing an understanding of mindfulness that is not reducible to a technology of self-optimization or a rational ordering of subjectivity. Such an undertaking would not consist in either a rescuing of mindfulness for phenomenology or a rescuing of phenomenology itself. Rather, the task of such an emancipatory project must develop from an understanding of the subject and the various technologies of its intensification and optimization as what must be overcome, without collapsing into a facile moralism that understands emancipation as salvation from evil. As such, this chapter proposes that an emancipatory understanding of mindfulness cannot, on the one hand, be synonymous with a regime of training or subsumed within an idealized reflective structure of human subjectivity on the other. Tanabe Hajime and Martin Heidegger are two thinkers who broach the larger question of the implications of such mindfulness beyond subjective experience and self-control, and therefore also link the possibility of freedom as something lying beyond the will to power. They accomplish this through a deconstruction of traditional notions of subjectivity in their own distinctive ways. As a result, bringing both philosophers into a critical dialogue can positively contribute to an emancipatory understanding of mindfulness and subjectivity. So in this brief chapter synopsis, we will first explore Tanabe's preferred method for overcoming subjectivity, namely mindfulness as what he calls metanoetics, which is a form of dialectical existentialism. Second, it will put Tanabe's metanoetics into a critical dialogue with Heidegger's own stand-in for mindfulness, namely Besinnung. As will be shown, while Tanabe's metanoetics aims to overcome subjectivity by dissolving it into a communal subject or species, Heidegger's Besinnung does so by way of a deconstruction of all such ecological and species-centric modes of thought. The main claim, therefore, will be that Besinnung provides a more compelling basis for an emancipatory project by avoiding some of the core ethical and political problems that plague Tanabe's metanoetics. So, Tanabe's approach to mindfulness and subjectivity. In the work of Tanabe, the individual subject is unthinkable outside the context within which it exists, what Tanabe calls variously contingency, history, or species. The individual and the species exist in a dialectical relationship of constitutive negation, in which each perpetuates the other while having no distinct existence of its own. The species provides the history into which the individual is born, and the individual constitutes and transforms the species through its will to power, or what Tanabe, borrowing from the Buddhist tradition, calls self-power. Due to the reciprocal relationship between the species and the individual, neither is given a privileged ontological position. Just as species might refer to any community of individuals, an individual might be born into any community. In contradistinction to other thinkers of the Kyoto school, the question of appealing does not enter into Tanabe's thinking. Indeed, for Tanabe, there is nothing inherently emancipatory about the species or the individual. Rather, this relationship forms the basis of the problem that he wishes to overcome through the introduction of an emancipatory transcendental gesture. The dialectical economy of species and individuals is like a broken machine, a rudderless boat swept adrift by the capricious tide of conflicting self-interests. The engine of self-power, however, is also too chaotic, too inefficient to be left to its own devices. Without an ethics of social responsibility, dangerous individuals have placed the fate of the species at risk. To that end, Tanabe proposes the intervention of what he calls other power. Tanabe's emancipatory gesture, therefore, is not to be identified with any particular world historical agent or community. As such, only those who have been purified of all self-interest are fit to steer the ship of the species. Not necessarily as rulers, but as agents of transformative negation. Although this expediency is never ruled out in the service of a noble end. The relationship between the species and the individual remains unaltered. It is the power driving that economy that has changed. So now on to self-negation, metanoia, and other power. In order for other power to enter into the dialectical economy of the species and the individual subject must first be vacated of self-power via self-negation or metanoia. Self-negation differs from the constitutive negation that the species works upon the individual subject in that it is not driven by the will to power of other individuals of the species. Self-negation is the transformation of the will to power into what Tanabe calls the will to salvation. That takes the form of a confession in which, quote, one recognizes the evil of the self and abandons its right to exist, end quote. This is quoting Tanabe. Though metanoesis is something that must be actively practiced, its accomplishment is not the self-accomplishment of the contemplative subject, but rather a submission to the other power of absolute nothingness. Absolute mediation is a transformation of the individual's self-power into the selflessness of absolute negation or nothingness that, quote, makes what is other to itself everything, end quote. The result of this metanoetic process, in which the individual subject dies and is reborn, is the advent of the universal as great compassion within the individual. The individual awakens as a kind of action witness of other power. Because of the contingent relation between the individual and the species, this affirmation qua negation, in which the self-power of the individual is replaced by other power, has definite consequences for the species. As an embodiment of universal totality, the awakened individual thus exists to steer the species away from the dangers of its own specificity. In doing so, they recognize the species as the ground of metanoetic mediation. Far from upsetting the equilibrium of the dialectical economy of species and individual, metanoesis utilizes the constitutive negation of the species to the individual in order to produce more awakened individuals. The awakened individual mediates the awakening of the species, which in turn mediates the awakening of more individuals. In other words, quoting Tanabe, the governments of the kingdoms of man become the mediation for the religious foundation of the kingdom of God, end quote. If Tanabe's end result sounds similar to the political status quo, it is intentional. His affirmation qua negation is not intended to break with what already exists world historically. Rather, it is the optimization of what is already existent. Through this process of metanoesis, the radical evil of subjective relativity and the specificity of the species are brought closer to the ideal of total universality, referred to variously as the kingdom of God or sometimes the pure land. As this occurs, the mediating institutions of governance as, quote, the highest concrete form of the worldly relative human existence, end quote, are essential for realizing the goal of absolute mediation, of absolute conversion. Owing to the dialectical logic through which the kingdom of God is realized, one might even venture to say that the conversion of said governing institutions to other power is the goal of absolute conversion. From this perspective, the species and the individuals, social relations, and governmental institutions that comprise its constituency are base material or resource who exist to be transmuted for the sake of constituting the kingdom of God on earth. In this light, the problem of the relative subject and its radical evil, for Tanabe, is a problem of use. The individual that is not useful, is unproductive, is one who is not working towards the perfection of the species. Hence, it is possible to claim that Tanabe's solution to the problem of subjectivity is its reduction to the status of what Heidegger would call standing reserve, or Bestand, to a stock or reserve of beings whose being is exhausted in advance by the purpose to which it is assigned, or for which it is conscripted. This absolute nihilism of the age of technicity, or Gestell, which for Heidegger is to be overcome through a new beginning that involves Besinnung as a form of inceptual thought, thus acquires the status of the apogee of the species. In this light, Tanabe's self-negation becomes the mechanism through which world historical governance is empowered. Indeed, Tanabe's mediation functions ethically as the pathologizing of any and all elements that resist subsumption within the prevailing social order. Thus, while coercive force, governance, and national mandate might be justified in Tanabe's program as an expedient means, it might ideally unfold as the transformation of contingency, such that each individual would, of their own accord, submit themselves in obedience to other power. Regardless, the goal of absolute conversion remains the same. Now on to Heidegger's deconstruction of subjectivity through Bézinon. Subjectivity, machination, and technicity. So I'll start with a quote, a very short quote from Heidegger. The rational animal has become subject and has developed reason into history, whose sway coincides with the sway of technicity, end quote. That's from Das Ereignis. Heidegger begins his assessment of the subject and its relation to contingency from a similar premise, but that is really the full extent of any similarities between his thinking and that of Tanabe. For Heidegger, the individual subject is not a matter of radical evil. In fact, one might say that the problem of the subject is that its world historical contingency precludes the possibility of radical inquiry. And this is because the reciprocal relation between the subject and its world historical contingency is one of production or producibility. The individual has become a productive subject that produces its own history. In return, history has become the producer of its subjects. The total effect of this is to produce a completed hermeneutic circle of the subject, such that one aspect of production grounds the other in a loop of perpetual deferral. What this productive negation qua affirmation serves to conceal is the fundamental groundlessness of this relationship in the first place. Tanabe's response to this groundlessness is an appeal to a transcendental negation that functions as a kind of buffering power, strengthening the limit of this hermeneutical circle and transforming all attempts at negating any aspect of this closed ecology into an affirmation of its other parts. In this way, even negation has become a productive force. Heidegger's response to groundlessness, however, is quite different altogether. In an attempt at negating the very producibility behind the subject-contingency relationship or the subject-history relationship, his thinking leaps into a chasm from whence it originates, only there to overcome it at its root. Such inceptual inquiry seeks to, quote, shatter the machination of beings, end quote, not by delimiting said inquiry through the establishing of being as a ground, but through, quote, persevering in the uncease and cleft of a breakage, such that thinking of being never comes to rest in a work, end quote. Such an inquiry must unflinchingly face the groundlessness that undergirds the economy of beings. And now I will go on to Bézinon and a brief quote by Heidegger on Bézinon. Bézinon transports the man of the future into that between in which he belongs to being and yet remains a stranger amid all that which is, end quote. The machinational feature of technicity, historical contingency and its subjects in accordance with, the machinational feature of the technicity of world historical contingency and its subjects is in accordance with producibility. While this producibility evades an analysis at the level of a dialectical economy, when considered phenomenologically, neither the subject nor its contingency is found to be prior and thus capable of giving rise to the economy as a whole. In this respect, machination as producibility cannot then be understood as a grasping of things as they arise by a subject, but is the entire disposition, or the Foucauldian dispositif, that interpolates being into an economy of subject and object. An exclusionary violence or constitutive negation that discriminates an object to grasp and a subject to grasp it, the entire economy of beings to be refined as Bestand, and the power to scrutinize and police them. The economy as a whole is produced, its ground secured, in this singular gesture. Bézinon, Heidegger's proposed solution to machination, thus differs from Tanabe's self-negation in that it attempts a negation of producibility as such. Bézinon is a knowing awareness of being as inceptuality. This knowing awareness is not a knowledge, which is the product of securing one's experience, and in so doing produces both the subject and object, knower and known of knowledge. Knowing awareness is an attentive relation to inceptuality, the coming to be that has not yet been discriminated into knowledge. And I'll quote briefly from Heidegger. As a refusal, being extricates itself from every differentiation a la discriminated beings, end quote. As a refusal of discrimination, the knowing awareness of Besinnung does not seize the inceptuality of being as a productive ground in which to anchor and formulate a new subjectivity. Neither does it secure being as the ground of a pre-existent economy of phenomena. It is a refusal of ground, an abyss, Abgrund, and Besinnung is a perseverance in its between. From this perspective, any attempts at reclaiming a metaphysical positionality for being or securing from being a population of beings are merely machinational contrivances. As a no that cannot be sublated, the negativity of being as Abgrund makes no allowances for any positive remainder. It is not the affirmation qua negation of dialectics. It makes no appeal to a primordial ecology, but rather locates itself in the nowhere and the never of beings. This negativity not only exposes any attempts at reclaiming metaphysical positionality for being or securing from being a population of beings as fundamentally groundless, but also functions to unsettle all machination by understanding that affirmation functions as a selective discrimination, thus preempting the possibility of machination by persevering in the refusal of this discriminatory production. This in turn further functions to preempt second-order discrimination, namely the technical ordering of what has already been produced and rendered extant through machination. And now I'll briefly conclude with the epilogue, and I want to start here with a brief quote from Foucault on desubjectivation. Rising up must be practiced, by which I mean one must practice rejecting the subject status in which one finds oneself, the rejection of one's identity, the rejection of one's own permanence, the rejection of what one is. It's the first condition for rejecting the world, end quote. To conclude, while the two contrary possibilities for desubjectivation represented by Tanabe and Heidegger find themselves at odds with the current state of affairs, the former offers a lesson in ethical remedialism. For Tanabe, self-negation is not a first step in rejecting the world, but rather a first step in embracing and purifying it. The negation of subjects through their being integrated into the technical armature of governance. In this context, if the logical conclusions of Tanabe's view appear extreme and maybe even anachronistic, it is worth noting that contemporary critical theory is no stranger to the biologistic and organicist language of pathology. Over the last decade, social pathology has arguably become the most important concept in contemporary Frankfurt School social theory, for example, generating a considerable body of literature. Indeed, this should be not surprising, considering that the origin of the organicist biologistic metaphors can be traced back to a common source in Tanabe and critical the thought of Hegel. Given that the outline of the emancipatory project of Besinnung developed here is premised upon a rejection of all ecological, biological, or species-centric thinking, it resists subsumption within the burgeoning literature on social pathologies as well. Giorgio Agamben has written that the paradigm under which dominion we find ourselves, what he calls the political ontological machine, is a splitting of possibility from reality, essence from existence. This machine, this machinational productivism, is that with which a non-remedial desubjectivation necessarily finds itself at odds. The negation of the subject position is thus the negation of the positioning of possibility as a potential to be realized as the political ontological economy of resources and their use. Such a desubjectivation is done not merely to expose the cracks concealed within the foundations of power, but to open out an ethos that does not already presuppose the technical apparatus of political ontology within which every ethical decision and all possible praxis have been consigned and predetermined. But moving outside of the telos of realization, a being possible that persists as a disruption of the real, necessitates a type of thinking that engages the possible in terms of its unrealizability, which is not the forbidden distance of the impossible, but the nearness of being that needs no affirmation, development, or articulation for its fulfillment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kurt, for your presentation. Very dense, really. So let's open the floor for the dialogue. I'm not able to see any virtual hand. So just in case you want to say something, please open the mic. So if there are no remarks or question, Christos, I would like to propose you to end the meeting here because time is running out. And perhaps we can add the 2 missing videos to the recording once it is ready. What do you think?
Yeah, I wanted to thank everyone who presented today. I wanted to say also that 2 people sent us a pre-recorded presentation to play it, but unfortunately we don't have time. That's Georgios, Petropoulos, and Francesca Greco, and we will add these presentations on the video that we'll upload on Francesca's channel and on PhenoLab channel. So thank you once again, everyone, for participating in this great volume, in my opinion. And I hope it will, have an effect in phenomenological studies and in mindfulness studies in the near future. Thanks once again, and good night from me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christos. And thank you from my side to all the participants, not only to this event, to the book launch, but especially for those who contributed to the volume. It has been a pleasure to host the event here at the PhenoLab, and I hope to get in touch with you as soon as possible. Bye.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to Susi and Christos for inviting me in this brilliant event and for bringing this volume together. I've really enjoyed reading the chapters of this volume. What I've prepared here is a short presentation of my contribution to this volume. So in my chapter, what I attempt to do is to develop an account of Pyrrhonian skepticism that contradicts the view of Pyrrhonism as an excessive and impractical form of skepticism. A well-known concept of Pyrrhonian skepticism is that of Epoche, which is usually translated in English as a suspension of judgment. The concept, however, is not unambiguous. Some scholars interpret Pyrrhonian Epoche as demanding a complete absence of beliefs, rendering Pyrrhonism untenable, since, as they argue, such a life would condemn someone to life-denying inactivity. In my contribution for this volume, I have attempted to bring forth a different interpretation of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which proves that Pyrrhonian philosophy can be beneficial and exert an influence on how we understand our relation to the world and others. I do so by focusing first on an interpretation that brings Pyrrhonism close to the non-judgment aspects of mindfulness, and then by showing how Pyrrhonian skepticism sheds light to the human-world correlation, prefiguring thus an important phenomenological insight. In the first section of my chapter, I explore how Pyrrhonism relates to non-judgment and mindfulness, focusing on the Buddhist tradition and modern versions of mindfulness-based therapy. 2 aspects of Pyrrhonian skepticism that seem to point eastward are first, the suspension of judgment about dogmatic truths, and second, the fact that Pyrrhonists present themselves as therapeutic philosophers who seek ataraxia, tranquility. Scholars like John Paul Flintoff and Andrian Kuzminski link the Pyrrhonian non-dogmatic stance with the Buddhist problematization of our tendency to cling to fixed views. Furthermore, they suggest that both Buddhism and Pyrrhonian skepticism are motivated by a therapeutic goal. In the case of Pyrrhonism, it is a goal of overcoming disturbance, tarahi, and in the case of Buddhism, it is the goal of overcoming suffering, dukkha. Pyrrhonism can be linked also to modern versions of Buddhism, especially mindfulness-based therapy. This is what, for example, Joseph Mattes suggests in his paper titled Acting as a Pyrrhonist. Like mindfulness therapy, Pyrrhonism has the potential of alleviating mental disturbance caused by rigid beliefs and cultivating cognitive diffusion. Cognitive diffusion in this context refers to a person's capacity to notice and stay with your feelings without adding the judgment that those feelings are bad or good, true or false. Mattes suggests not only that the Pyrrhonists are not paralyzed by inactivity, but that their way of life could actually be quite beneficial. But there is more to explore here. The concept of non-judgment deserves a closer look. In their article Phenomenology and Mindfulness, Stone and Zahavi critically reflect on current attempts to bring mindfulness and phenomenology together. The points developed by Stone and Zahavi are important because they invite us to ask if by non-judgment we are hinting toward the idea of a pure or a bare perception in a way that contradicts phenomenological insights about subject-world correlation. As I try to show, the non-judgment element of Pyrrhonism does not point to a desire to reach a pure perception. On the contrary, I argue that one of the philosophical merits of Pyrrhonism is that it directs our attention to the way in which we are always in the world. Now, the attempt to link phenomenology to any kind of skepticism might appear at first sight problematic. However, there is space, I think, for linking the two philosophical traditions. First of all, one should notice that Husserl himself does at times include skepticism in what we could call the prehistory of phenomenology. This idea that Pyrrhonism can be thought of as being part of the prehistory of phenomenology is also hinted at by scholars like Klaus Held, Teresa Petropoulos-Valala, and John Heaton. John Heaton, for example, suggests that Pyrrhonian skeptics can be seen as forerunners of the Heideggerian notion of being in the world, in the sense that they question the ability of language to express truth by assertion and challenge the distinction between an inner sphere and the external world. This is an interpretation that I have explored further in my chapter by focusing on Heidegger's account of judgment in Being and Time and his earlier works. The key point that Heidegger consistently develops during the 20s is that the possibility of finding truth or falsity in an assertion is based on a more fundamental experience of truth as unconcealment. Heidegger's phenomenology develops this last point in a hermeneutic direction, suggesting that judgments or assertions presuppose a pre-reflective understanding of things through our direct engagement with the world, what he calls circumspective understanding. In the famous example of the hammer, Heidegger seeks to convey that the hammer is primarily revealed to us as something ready to hand in the practice of hammering, and not as an object of assertion or judgment. The possibility of making the hammer an object of judgment emerges when we take a step back and approach it from a theoretical, a detached perspective. Now, while Heidegger acknowledges that the detached perspective is a genuine possibility of Dasein, he does argue that it can have a limiting effect on us insofar as it makes us lose sight of the relationality of human existence, namely the fact that we are always and already immersed into a context of meaningful relations, what he calls being in the world. Heidegger therefore challenges the idea that judgment or assertion is where primordial truth is to be found. Such an assumption, he suggests, signals the emergence of the subject-object distinction. In judgments or assertions, the relational aspect of human perception gets transformed to such an extent that we end up reducing beings to merely present and isolated things that await a judging subject to add meaning to them. Going back to the idea of a pure perception, we can now say that from a Heideggerian perspective, it is from such a reductive understanding of things as merely present that the notion of pure or bare perception emerges. So the most important deficiency of judgment is that it tends not to take into consideration the hermeneutic features of human experience. Pyrrhonism, I claim in my chapter, shows the derivative nature of assertions and judgments, and in doing so invites us to thematize the pre-reflective manifestation of beings in our everyday lives. To make sense of this point, I suggest that we should focus on two positive claims that the Pyrrhonists make. First, that they do not question phenomena, but only the assertions made about phenomena, and second, that they do not challenge everyday living experience. Emphasizing on these positive claims allows us to understand Pyrrhonism as a philosophy that first challenges the prioritization of theoretical assertions over concrete experience, and second, as a philosophy that makes insightful observations about human facticity. Pyrrhonism, I suggest, points precisely to the derivative essence of judgments in a way that corroborates Heidegger's claims. Throughout the outlines of Pyrrhonism, Sextus Empiricus is at pains to show that the Pyrrhonists are not making dogmatic assertions about the nature of things. When they announce that something appears to them in such and such way, they are merely reporting, and I quote, a human feeling which is apparent to the person who feels it, end of quote. In other words, the Pyrrhonian announcements should not be understood as judgments about things as such, but as statements that reveal the concrete experience of the Pyrrhonist. Furthermore, the Pyrrhonists observe that our experiences are never experiences from nowhere, but always experiences that involve bodily and affective dispositions. This in turn points to a positive appreciation of human facticity that has been explicitly thematized by phenomenologists and Heidegger in particular. Indeed, Sextus Empiricus goes so far as to claim that the idea of having no disposition at all is absurd. Another point worth mentioning is that when the Pyrrhonists claim that they give assent to phenomena, they are not referring only to sense perceptions. For the Pyrrhonist, an action can appear immoral, an argument can appear valid, and a political regime can appear unjust. It is therefore crucial to bear in mind that among the things that the Pyrrhonist accepts are the dispositions that emerge from our intersubjectively constituted horizon of meaning, for example, laws, customs, and rules of conduct. These dispositions are for the Pyrrhonist constitutive aspects of human existence and as important as our bodily and affective dispositions. This means that Pyrrhonism not only challenges the dogmatic belief that we can reach the truth about a being as such, by way of theoretical assertions, but also seems aware of the factical dimension of human existence, the fact that human existence is an embodied, socially and culturally embedded being in the world. So bringing this short presentation to its conclusion, in my chapter I have attempted to show ways in which Pyrrhonian skepticism can be understood positively as a philosophy that provides important insights about the well-being of individuals, but also thematizes the situatedness of human existence in a way that prefigures the phenomenological thematization of human facticity. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Apologies for not being able to be there live. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event and have a lovely day. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Susi and Christos for the precious opportunity to be part of this huge project of the ROUTLEDGE Handbook of Phenomenology and Mindfulness. So thanks, Susi and Christos, for your great work with the authors and for the edition of the volume. I had the chance to contribute to the section about mindfulness in the Eastern traditions with a chapter that aims to bridge the practice of mindfulness as founded by John Kabat-Zinn in the 70s with a modern philosophical tradition from Japan, namely the logic of place, Basho Rondi, developed by Nishida Kitaro in the first half of the 20th century. The main link between these two approaches is the idea of a radical relationality, which I would like to sketch to you briefly today. So relationality is a term chosen by me, but inspired by Nishida's logic of place, with focus on models of relations in order to address the dynamic phenomenon of the entanglement of the world. In particular, I extrapolate the concept of relationality from two aspects of Nishida's philosophy. On the one hand, by following his attempt to think relations, kankei, from the relation itself. That is, not from the element that supposedly compose the relation. And on the other hand, by expanding his idea of absolute contradictory self-identity, of the world, sekai, with itself, which is a kind of paradoxical relation of the world with itself. But the heart of the relationality does not lie in the positive fact or action of relating elements to each other, like a kind of a web of relations in which one could even presuppose the existence of something that then relates to each other. Rather than that, the phenomenon of relationality aims to address the fact that this supposed element, as well as their particular relation, subsist in whatever way they do, precisely by virtue of the interconnectedness, in whatever way they are interconnected and whatever it is that is interconnected. Following Nishida's insight, when I refer to relationality, I mean the dynamic entangling, dynamic development, dotekihatten, of the word in itself, while forming itself without itself having a form, which brings us to the next aspect of relationality, its radicality. The phenomenon of relationality derived from such relational ontology is a radical one, because there is anything else than relations in the plural. Any substance, any object, a person, anything is formed by relations that at the ontological level are relations with themselves or relation of the world with itself. Anything has no existence, no substance in itself, but only relation. So one can say that nothing exists if not in relation, which could also be read as then nothing exists, precisely in relations. It is in this sense, thus, that relationality can be taken as a form of nothingness, even a form of emptiness that, insofar empty, indeterminate, it makes room for what particularly and uniquely arise. According to this, there are, in the strict sense, no relata in relations, since this would be relations as well, so relations of relations. And when something like a specific element of a specific relation can be distinguished, because it can be distinguished, as we usually do, define things and concepts, we should be mindful of not clinging to this specific form of relationship, because the relations have no proper form except the one that from time to time it takes. Now at this time and place, now at this time and place, uniquely and only once. Relata are unsubstantial substances. So, and here we hear again the echo of the contradiction, or in other words, substances based on nothingness. Namely, they are without base, ground, or foundation. Radical relationality therefore investigates phenomenologically something like negative subsistence on the basis of entanglements. Imagine in this regard a puppet or a figure made by woolen threads. Every single thread composed the puppet without being the puppet itself or the thread itself a part of it. And the puppet changed shape according to the relational wave composing it. By eventually pulling all the woolen threads, one after the other, the puppet first slowly deforms in the sense that it loses its previous form and then dissolves into nothingness, which is quite different from being destroyed, since we didn't annihilate the thread or the puppet. Thus, focusing on relationality means being mindful that the puppet subsists as a waving activity, in this case as a composition of woolen threads. And the interaction with the puppet should be considered the vertical relationality of this ontology, of its ontology. The puppet is a plot of nothingness disguised as a manifold disguised as a thing, where there was nothing and even not one thing. So displaying some aspect of such relational ontology reflected in Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness and in Nishida's logic of place, I wanted to show how, through the idea of relationality, the practice of mindfulness and the logic of place can mutually enhance and complement each other. Through radical relationality, my purpose was to provide an epistemic philosophical ground to the practice of mindfulness and a concrete and simple application for Nishida's logic of place. Concluding my chapter, I presented the practice of Chado, the way of tea, and the martial art of Aikido, which I would translate as a way of encounter, as specific experimental frames in which different aspects of radical relationality are amplified and condensed, and in which the combined relationality of mindfulness and of the logic of place can be experienced and analyzed in special material aspects regarding Chado and in interpersonal relations regarding Aikido. Whereas both this approach aim to bring the results to simple and basic activity of life regarding cognition and action, and as well as the management of pain and emotion, before reaching their effect in the most spontaneous way in the everyday life, their guiding idea can be actively trained and investigated. Learning to sense and track down the intertwining of relations, trying to both observe and act within this network, and, for example, to actively affect its swing, or by taking this phenomenon as an object of inquiry. In the last case, not exclusively in a theoretical setting, since we are practicing ourselves. The conception and practices of radical relationality transform the subject's relation to their surrounding, and finally modifying the general ideas and activity of the individual themselves, as well as their way to this way of dealing with the world. So the title of my chapter is Radical Relationality, a philosophical approach to mindfulness inspired by Nishida. And I would love to hear thoughts and questions and comments from you, also by email or at the next conference, as I was unable to attend in person, even digitally this time. But thank you for your attention, and I wish you a good continuation. Bye.